My name is Sarah Mitchell, and I am 32 years old, and I have been in the United States Army for 10 years. And in those 10 years, I have navigated a forward operating base in Kandahar province during a mortar attack. I have held a pressure bandage on a wound that should have killed the man underneath my hands, and watched him survive anyway. And I have stood in front of a general in a room full of decorated officers and received a silver star for actions I still don't entirely know how to talk about at dinner parties. None of those things made me as uncomfortable as the phone call I received from my mother on a Tuesday evening, 7 days before my brother's wedding. I want to describe that call carefully, because I think the specific quality of what was asked of me matters for understanding everything that came after it. My mother, whose name is Patricia, and who has a specific gift for delivering unreasonable requests in the tone of someone simply pointing out an obvious practical consideration, called me at 7:15 while I was sitting in my apartment in Fayetteville, North Carolina, still in my PT clothes after an evening run, eating leftover pasta and doing exactly nothing that could be described as a threat to anyone. "Sarah," she said, after the preliminary warmth that she uses to cushion things she knows will land badly, "I want to talk to you about the wedding, about what you're planning to wear." I had, in fact, already decided what I was planning to wear, and I want to be honest that my decision, at that point, had been arrived at without any particular intention of making a statement. I had been invited to my brother Jason's wedding as his sister, a member of his family, a person who would be sitting in the third row on the left side, while he married a woman named Jennifer Hartwell, whose family owned 3 car dealerships in suburban Connecticut, and who had, from what I understood of her through the handful of interactions we'd had across the previous 2 years, perfectly pleasant, if slightly remote feelings toward me as a future sister-in-law. I had planned to wear my army dress blues because they are my formal attire. They are the clothes I wear to formal occasions. I own exactly one set of clothes that could be described as genuinely formal. The uniform, pressed and complete, with the ribbons and the silver star and the rank insignia that represent 10 years of the most significant work of my life. And I own a small collection of civilian clothes that range in formality from business casual to probably fine for a nice dinner, none of which rise to the level of a Saturday afternoon wedding in a Connecticut venue that had, according to the invitation, a dress code listed as black tie optional. "I was planning to wear my dress uniform," I said. "It's the only formal thing I own." There was the specific pause my mother uses when she is about to say something she has already said to someone else and received agreement from, and is now surprised to find requires a conversation. "I know, sweetheart, but Jennifer's family, they're a certain kind of people, you know? Very traditional, very Connecticut. And your father and I were thinking that maybe this once, just for Jason's day, it might be easier for everyone if you wore something else. Something more," she paused again, reaching for a word, "feminine." I want to describe what I felt hearing that specific word, because I think it's the most important word in this entire story, more important even than anything that happened in a Connecticut wedding venue 7 days later. Feminine. As though my dress uniform, with its tailored jacket and its straight lines and its ribbons representing a decade of service, was the opposite of that word. As though the silver star on my chest, awarded for pulling 2 soldiers out of a burning vehicle under direct enemy fire, a detail I will get to, was somehow incompatible with being a woman at a wedding. I had heard versions of this my entire life. I want to be honest about that, because I think the phone call would be less meaningful without the context of the decade of smaller conversations that had built up to it. My mother had never been cruel about my career. She had never said, directly, that she wished I had chosen differently. What she had done across 10 years was manage the presentation of my career to other people in the specific, careful way you manage something you're not sure how to be proud of. She mentioned my service the way you mention a relative's unconventional life choice, warmly but briefly, with a slightly uncertain smile, moving the conversation forward before anyone could ask too many questions. My father got on the line then, because my mother had apparently put the call on speaker while my father sat somewhere nearby, which is a coordination they deploy specifically when they want the weight of both of them in a conversation. "You know how you look in that thing," he said, with the specific deflecting warmth he uses when he's saying something unkind while hoping it won't register as unkind. Very impressive, very serious. This is supposed to be a celebration. Very impressive, very serious, as though these were problems. I'll think about it, I said, because I had learned across 32 years of being my parents' daughter that I'll think about it is the only response that ends a conversation of this type without either capitulating to it or creating a fight over the phone that will simply restart in person. I hung up and sat in my apartment with my pasta going cold on the coffee table, and I looked at the dress uniform hanging on the back of my bedroom door, which is where I keep it because it's the first thing I want to see in the morning, the same way some people keep a photograph or a piece of art, something that reminds them, in the specific shorthand of a single image, of who they are and what they've chosen and why they chose it. I looked at the silver star. It is a 5-pointed star, silver, with an eagle in the center, and it hangs on a ribbon of blue and red, and it was placed around my neck by a 2-star general on a Tuesday morning in Fort Bragg 18 months ago, in a ceremony that my parents attended and during which, according to my own memory of scanning the audience during the general's remarks, my father spent approximately 4 minutes looking at his phone. I thought about Jennifer Hartwell's family and their 3 Connecticut car dealerships, and the black tie optional dress code, and what more feminine was supposed to mean from the mouth of a man who had never once in my entire career asked me what I actually did on the days I wasn't home for holidays. And then I did something that I want to describe precisely, because I think the simplicity of it is the whole point. I finished my pasta. I watched 30 minutes of a show I don't fully remember. I went to bed. In the morning, I took my dress uniform off the back of the door, checked the ribbons, confirmed the silver star was properly centered, and hung it back on the door in exactly the same position it had been in before the phone call. I did not call my mother back. I did not tell anyone what I had decided. I simply knew, in the specific, settled way of someone who has spent 10 years learning the difference between a decision that needs to be explained and a decision that simply needs to be made, that I was going to walk into that Connecticut wedding venue in 7 days, wearing the uniform I had earned, on the body I had trained, with the medal I had been given for doing the most difficult thing I have ever done in my life. And I drove to Fort Bragg the next morning, put in a full day of work, and did not think about it again until Thursday, when my mother called a second time, this time to tell me, with the specific careful confidence of someone reporting a fait accompli, that she had already told several of the wedding guests that I would be coming in civilian clothes, because she'd assumed I had come around. She had assumed. That was the word she used. She had assumed I had come around, and she had told people, and now the story she had decided to tell on my behalf had already been distributed to an audience I hadn't known was listening. I want to describe what that information did to a decision I had already made, because I think it's the most honest answer to the question of why I walked into that wedding the way I did. And it's not the dramatic answer people expect. It didn't make me angry, not exactly. It made me clear. The specific, uncluttered clarity of someone who has just understood that the only remaining question about the decision she's already made is whether she has the steadiness to follow through with it in a room full of people who've been told a different story. I had been clear before Thursday. After Thursday, I was something beyond clear. I was certain. And when I arrived at the Hartwell family's venue in Greenwich, Connecticut, 6 days later, on a Saturday afternoon in September, in my army dress blues, with my silver star centered precisely on my chest and my service ribbons in the correct order of precedence, I was not making a statement about my parents, or about Jennifer Hartwell, or about anyone in that room. I was simply showing up as exactly who I was, in the only formal clothes I owned, to watch my brother get married. What happened next was not something I planned or anticipated or could have predicted. But I want to tell you about the man in the first row, and what he did the moment he saw me walk through those doors, and why 12 other men in that room did the same thing before I'd taken 10 steps down the aisle. To understand why walking into that venue in my dress uniform felt, to me, like the most natural thing in the world, you have to understand how I got the uniform in the first place, and what it cost, and what it means, and why those things matter in a way that my family has spent 10 years quietly, consistently failing to understand. I enlisted at 22, which is later than most, after 2 years of a biology degree I was genuinely good at and genuinely uninterested in, the specific combination that produces, in certain kinds of people, a restlessness that classroom work can't resolve. I had grown up in a family that was comfortable, conventionally aspirational, the specific suburban Connecticut version of a life organized around the assumption that success looked like a certain kind of professional degree, followed by a certain kind of career, followed by a certain kind of house in a certain kind of neighborhood. My father ran a mid-sized insurance brokerage. My mother had worked part-time in interior design before she'd had Jason and me, and decided, with no apparent regret, to stop. The expectation for both of us, never stated directly but present in every conversation about the future, the way wallpaper is present in a room, was that we would follow a recognizable path toward a recognizable version of success. Jason followed it. He went to UConn, got a business degree, went into sales, met Jennifer Hartwell at a colleague's party 3 years ago, and proceeded to build, with what I think is genuine happiness and genuine effort, exactly the life our parents had always imagined for their children. I say this without any resentment toward Jason, because I think he genuinely wanted that life and built it genuinely, and the fact that it was also exactly what our parents wanted is a coincidence that worked out well for everyone, including him. I did not follow it. I want to be honest about what my enlistment decision actually looked like from the inside, because I think people assume it was dramatic, a sudden calling, a moment of patriotic clarity, something cinematic. It wasn't. It was more like the quiet recognition, sitting in a biology lecture on a Tuesday afternoon in October of my sophomore year, that the path I was on was going to produce, in 10 years, someone I would recognize but not particularly like, and that the only way to avoid that outcome was to do something that felt genuinely, completely uncertain, which was, at 22, the only real definition of courage I had access to. My parents' reaction to my enlistment was not the explosion I had braced for. It was something I found, in some ways, harder to navigate, a specific, sustained, quietly expressed bewilderment that never fully resolved into either acceptance or opposition, that simply existed, for 10 years, as an undertone in every conversation we had about my life. My mother's version of this was a particular smile she deployed when she mentioned my career to other people. Warm, proud adjacent, slightly uncertain, the smile of someone describing a life choice they genuinely don't know how to evaluate. My father's version was more direct. He called it impressive so often and in such a specific tone that the word had, over years, become the sound of someone being praised for something nobody intends to ask follow-up questions about. I was commissioned as an officer 4 years in, after completing officer candidate school on top of my enlisted service, and I want to describe what that night felt like. The night I made 01, first lieutenant, because I think it's the emotional center of everything that came later, including the phone call about the wedding and the dress uniform hanging on my door. I called my parents to tell them. It was 11 at night, which I should have accounted for. But I was 26 and genuinely thrilled in a way I hadn't felt about anything in years, and I wanted to share it with the people I'd grown up wanting to share things with. My father picked up, sounding half asleep, and said, "That's great, sweetheart," in a voice I've heard him use when Jason texts about a good sales quarter. And my mother said she was proud of me and asked if this meant I'd have more regular hours now, which it didn't, and which she seemed genuinely hopeful about, as though the problem with the previous 4 years had primarily been the scheduling. I want to tell you about Afghanistan, not because the story of what happened there is the point of this particular account, but because the Silver Star is the point, and the Silver Star requires context to mean anything. I was deployed to Kandahar province in the fall of my 7th year of service as part of an advisory mission, and I want to be precise about what my role involved because I think the specific work matters. I was responsible for coordinating medical evacuation logistics for a sector covering 4 forward operating bases and a population of approximately 1,100 personnel, which sounds administrative until you understand that coordinating medical evacuation logistics during an active engagement means being the person who calculates, under fire, in real time, which wounded soldiers can wait and which ones cannot, and then communicating those calculations clearly enough for helicopter pilots to make decisions they can live with. On a Wednesday morning in March, a vehicle convoy returning from a patrol encountered an IED strike that disabled 2 vehicles and produced a fire. I was at the nearest FOB, 400 meters away, monitoring comms. What happened in the following 11 minutes is documented in the award citation, which I have memorized, not because I am proud of it in any simple way, but because the words in it are the most honest description of that morning I have ever found. I drove to the strike site in a support vehicle. I extracted 2 soldiers from a burning MRAP while the vehicle's ammunition began cooking off. Both soldiers survived. One of them lost his left hand. The other, a 23-year-old from Baton Rouge named Marcus Webb, still calls me on my birthday every year, which he has done without fail for the past 4 years. The Silver Star is the 3rd highest military combat decoration in the United States Armed Forces. It is awarded, specifically, for gallantry in action against an enemy of the United States. It is not given for administrative achievement, or for good performance reviews, or for showing up consistently over a long period of time. It is given for a specific act, on a specific day, in a specific set of circumstances that most people will never encounter, and that the people who do encounter them would, nearly universally, have preferred not to. My parents attended the ceremony. I want to tell you everything I know about their experience of that ceremony, because I have thought about it more than almost any other single event in our shared history. My mother wore a blue dress she had bought specifically for the occasion, which I know because she mentioned it on the phone the week before. She cried when the general placed the medal around my neck, which I saw from the stage, and I want to be honest that those tears meant something to me, because they were real, and because she had come, and because showing up is not nothing. My father shook hands with the general afterward and said, with genuine pride in his voice, that his daughter was quite something. I have held on to that sentence because it was the most direct expression of pride I received from him that day. What I also know, because my unit's administrative sergeant, a woman named Donna who has a gift for observational detail and no particular filter on sharing it, told me afterward with the specific, apologetic honesty of someone who thinks you deserve to know something uncomfortable. My father spent 4 minutes of the general's 6-minute remarks looking at his phone. Donna had been sitting 2 rows behind my parents and had watched it happen. She told me not because she wanted to hurt me, but because, I think, she understood that I already knew, somewhere I wasn't quite looking at directly, and that knowing explicitly is always better than knowing in the peripheral, unconfirmed way. Jason did not attend the ceremony. He sent me a text that morning that read, "So proud of you, sis. Wish I could be there, killing it at work," with 2 emoji, which I read standing in the parking lot of the venue where I was about to receive a decoration for pulling 2 people out of a burning vehicle, and which I responded to with a thumbs up, because I had learned, by then, to calibrate my expectations of my brother to what he had consistently demonstrated he was able to offer. He has never, in 4 years, asked me what happened in Afghanistan. Not once, in 4 years of holidays and phone calls and the occasional family dinner, has my brother asked me to tell him the story that resulted in the medal he will have seen, eventually, displayed somewhere in photographs. The medal his mother was going to ask me to cover up or leave at home 7 days before his wedding. I want to be clear that I don't tell you this to condemn Jason. I tell you this because it's the context without which the wedding makes no sense. The context without which a woman choosing to wear her own formal clothes to her own brother's wedding looks like a statement rather than what it actually was, which was simply a woman showing up as herself, in the only formal clothes she owned, to an event she'd been invited to attend. When I put that uniform on the morning of Jason's wedding, I did not think about the phone call. I did not think about feminine or impressive, or 4 minutes of a general's speech spent looking at a phone screen. I thought about Marcus Webb, who calls me on my birthday, and who has a daughter now, born 8 months after we were both in Kandahar. I thought about the 11 minutes. I thought about the specific, clear morning light of a Connecticut September, coming through my hotel room window while I checked my ribbons in the mirror, and about the fact that the person looking back at me was someone I had spent 10 years working to become, and that no single phone call, regardless of who made it and what they asked, was going to change what she was wearing to walk into a room. I drove to the venue, I parked. I walked toward the entrance in my dress blues, and I want to describe the first person I encountered because it set the tone for everything that happened inside. He was a parking attendant, maybe 19 years old, in a white shirt and a vest, and he looked up from the clipboard he was holding as I approached, and his eyes went immediately to the silver star, and then to my rank, and then back to my face, and he stood up a little straighter, not dramatically, not performatively, just the specific, unconscious straightening of someone whose body has responded to something before their brain has finished processing what it's seeing. "Good afternoon, Captain," he said. I smiled at him. "Good afternoon." I walked through the doors of the Hartwell family's venue, into a room of approximately 150 people in their finest clothes, and the first person I made eye contact with was a man in the front row, late 70s, silver-haired, straight-backed in the specific way that never fully leaves a person who has worn a uniform for years, wearing a suit with a single row of service ribbons pinned to the lapel. He saw the silver star before he saw anything else. I could tell because his eyes went there first, the same way the parking attendants had, the specific recognition of someone who knows exactly what they're looking at. And then he began to rise from his seat. I want to describe the specific mechanics of what happened in that room, because I think the order of events matters as much as the events themselves, and because I have replayed those first 4 minutes of walking into that venue so many times since that I can recall them with the specific, almost cinematic clarity of a memory that has been handled so often it has become something close to permanent. The man in the front row was named Colonel Richard Hartwell, retired. I didn't know that when he stood up. I didn't know anything about him except what I could read from his posture and his ribbons, and the specific quality of attention he brought to the moment. The attention of someone who has spent years in rooms where attention meant something, where reading a situation correctly and responding appropriately was not a social courtesy, but a professional requirement. He rose slowly, the way men in their late 70s rise from chairs, with the specific, deliberate care of someone managing a body that requires more management than it used to, but with a straightness in his spine that had nothing to do with age and everything to do with decades of a particular kind of discipline. He rose to his full height and he stood, quietly, without saying anything, looking at me with an expression I want to try to describe accurately because I think it matters. Not sentimentality, not performance, something more like recognition. The specific acknowledgement of one person who has done a particular kind of work by another person who has done the same kind of work, in the wordless language that exists between people who share a reference point most rooms don't contain. The second man stood 11 seconds later. I counted, afterward, because I needed to reconstruct the sequence, and 11 seconds is the number I landed on. He was younger than the colonel, maybe 60, heavyset, with the kind of hands that suggest physical work across decades, and he was sitting 3 rows back on the right side in what I would later understand was the Hartwell family's section of the venue. He stood the same way, quietly, without announcement, without looking around to see if anyone else was doing it, simply standing because standing was the right response to what he was seeing. Then a third man, across the aisle. Then 2 more, almost simultaneously, near the back. Then another in the middle of a row who had to excuse himself past the people beside him, who moved their knees without quite understanding yet why they were doing it. Then another. Then another. I kept walking. I want to be honest that I did not stop walking, did not pause to acknowledge what was happening, not because I was unaffected by it, but because stopping would have made it about me, and I understood, with the specific professional instinct of someone who has spent years in situations where composure is the most important thing you can offer a room, that continuing to walk was the correct thing to do. I kept my pace even, my eyes forward, my hands at my sides, the same posture I maintained during any formal proceeding, and I walked down that aisle while 12 men stood in sequence around me, and I took my seat in the 3rd row on the left, and I looked at the altar where my brother would be standing in approximately 40 minutes. The room had gone, by that point, very quiet. Not the uncomfortable silence of something going wrong, but the specific, weighted quiet of a room that has just witnessed something it didn't expect and hasn't yet found language for. I was aware of it the way you're aware of temperature, present, undeniable, not requiring any particular response. I was also aware, without looking directly, of my mother. She was seated in the second row, which I could see in my peripheral vision, and I was aware of her the way you are aware of someone you know well in a room you're trying not to make about yourself, by the quality of her stillness, which was different from the stillness of the room around her, tighter and more brittle, the specific stillness of someone absorbing something they hadn't planned for. I want to tell you what happened next, because it's the part of the story I didn't anticipate, and because it's more important, I think, than the 12 men standing. The woman who walked over to me, before the ceremony began, while the guests were still settling back into their seats, and the murmur of conversation was slowly rebuilding around the edges of the room, was not someone I expected. She was perhaps 65, elegantly dressed, silver-haired, with the specific composed authority of someone who manages significant rooms for a living, and she was, I would understand within the first 30 seconds of our conversation, Jennifer Hartwell's mother. Margaret Hartwell sat down in the empty seat beside me, the seat that had been intended for a cousin who was apparently running late, and she looked at me directly, with the specific directness of someone who has decided that indirection is going to cost more time than it saves. And she said something I want to reproduce as precisely as I can, because I have thought about it consistently since. My father served in Korea, she said. My husband served in Vietnam. My son served in Iraq and lost 2 friends there. I want you to know that there is no one in this family who is anything other than honored that you're here today, in that uniform. I want to describe what I felt hearing that sentence, because it arrived at the specific moment when I had been holding composure as a professional discipline rather than an emotional truth, and it found, I think, the exact place I had been protecting. I did not cry. I want to be honest about that, because I think crying would have been understandable, but also would have required putting something down that I wasn't ready to put down in a room full of people who were still adjusting to what had already happened. What I felt was something closer to the specific, physical sensation of a weight redistributing, not being removed, but shifting into a position I could carry more honestly. "Thank you," I said. "That means a great deal." She looked at me for another moment, the assessing look of someone who has spent years reading people in professional contexts and is doing it now without quite being able to stop. "Colonel Hartwell is my father-in-law," she said. "He's 81. He served 30 years. I haven't seen him stand up that fast in at least 5 years." I glanced toward the front row, where the colonel had returned to his seat and was sitting with the specific composed dignity of a man who has done what needed to be done and requires no discussion of it. "I didn't know he served," I said. "He doesn't mention it to most people," she said. "He says the people who need to know already know." She paused, and I thought she was finished, but she added one more sentence, quietly, almost as an aside before she stood to return to her own seat. "I want you to know that the conversation about the uniform, whatever was said to you before today, did not come from this family. I want that to be clear." She stood, smoothed her dress, and walked back to her seat with the specific, unhurried certainty of someone who has said the thing she came to say and has no need to wait for a response to confirm it. I sat with that information for the remainder of the time before the ceremony began, which was approximately 25 minutes, and I want to tell you what I was doing with it, because I think the internal experience of those 25 minutes is more revealing than almost anything else I could describe. I was reconstructing the phone call, not replaying it emotionally, but reconstructing it analytically, the way I reconstruct a situation report, identifying the actual source of each piece of information, tracing the decision tree backward to its origin. My mother had told me that Jennifer's family would be uncomfortable with the uniform. She had presented this as a fact about Jennifer's family, a consideration that came from them, a reason rooted in the specific, legitimate sensitivities of the people whose event this primarily was. Margaret Hartwell had just sat down beside me and told me, with the clear precision of someone who wanted no ambiguity on the point, that the consideration had not come from her family at all. I want to be careful about what I'm saying here, because I think precision matters more than narrative convenience. I don't know, and have never been able to fully establish, exactly where the Jennifer's family will be uncomfortable framing originated. What I know is that Margaret Hartwell told me it didn't come from her family. What I also know is that my mother had presented it to me as a fact about Jennifer's family, rather than as her own preference, which meant that either my mother had genuinely misunderstood something she'd been told, or she had used a third party's presumed discomfort as a more persuasive delivery mechanism for her own. I have spent considerable time since that day being honest with myself about which of those is more likely, given 10 years of experience with how my mother navigates conversations about my career. And I want to be equally honest with you that I have not landed on a definitive answer. Because I think the truth is probably somewhere in the specific, uncomfortable middle ground, where a person's genuine belief about what others think and their own preferences becomes so entangled that even they can no longer reliably tell them apart. What I knew, sitting in the third row in my dress uniform while the string quartet played and the room filled completely and my brother appeared at the end of the aisle looking, I want to say genuinely, like someone about to do the best thing he'd ever done, was this. The 12 men who had stood when I walked in were not a statement I had made. They were a response to something that was already true, something that had been true for 10 years, while a lot of people in my life had been finding polite ways not to look at it directly. I had simply walked into the room wearing it. The ceremony began. Jason stood at the altar with an expression I had never seen on my brother's face before. The specific, unguarded expression of someone who has stopped performing happiness because the real thing has finally shown up and made the performance unnecessary. Jennifer appeared at the end of the aisle in a dress that was, by any measure, exactly right for her, and I watched my brother watch his bride walk toward him, and I felt, underneath everything else I was carrying in that room, a genuine and uncomplicated happiness for him that had nothing to do with uniforms or phone calls or anything other than the specific, ordinary miracle of two people deciding to spend their lives together. The officiant spoke, the vows were exchanged. At some point during the exchange of rings, I became aware, without looking, that my mother had shifted positions slightly in the row ahead of me. The specific, almost imperceptible shift of someone who has been sitting rigidly for a period and has decided at some point to stop. I did not look at her. I watched my brother get married. And then, during the recessional, as Jason and Jennifer walked back up the aisle past the rows of guests, Jason glanced toward the third row on the left, found my face, and for 1 second, in the middle of his own wedding recessional, he looked at me with an expression I had not seen from my brother in years, something specific and unarmored and genuine, the face of someone who has just understood something he should have understood a long time ago and doesn't yet know what to do with the understanding. He kept walking. Jennifer's hand was in his, but he had looked, and I had seen it, and I think that look was the beginning of the conversation we were going to have later that evening, the one that mattered more to me than anything else that happened that day. I followed the guests out into the September afternoon, into the specific golden light of a Connecticut September, and I stood on the lawn outside the venue while people gathered around the newly married couple, and I felt, more than anything, the specific, clear-aired relief of someone who has done a simple, true thing and has let the room respond to it however the room needed to respond. I had not said a single word about my uniform to anyone. I had simply worn it, and the room, as it turned out, had known exactly what it meant without any of my help. The cocktail hour was held on the lawn behind the venue, the specific manicured Connecticut lawn that exists in a particular tax bracket and nowhere else. Wide, immaculate, with low hedges and stone paths, and white-clothed tables arranged with the precision of someone who had been paid significantly to make everything look effortless. The September light was doing the thing it does in New England in early fall, going gold and horizontal in a way that makes everything it touches look more considered than it actually is, and I stood at the edge of it all with a glass of sparkling water, because I don't drink at events where I'm in uniform, and watched my brother's wedding reception begin. I want to tell you what those first 40 minutes of the cocktail hour actually looked like from my vantage point, because I think the specific texture of them matters for understanding what came later. There were approximately 150 guests, and I was aware, in the peripheral way you're aware of being a known variable in a room, that my presence in uniform was generating a particular kind of social current, the low, continuous movement of people processing something, adjusting their expectations, deciding how to respond. Some of it was uncomfortable. I want to be honest about that, because the version of this story where everyone reacted with uncomplicated warmth would be tidier, but less true. There were guests who approached me directly, with the specific warmth of people who wanted to make a point of acknowledging what they'd seen inside. A handshake here, a brief, genuine exchange there, an older woman who had lost a son in Iraq and who gripped my hand for a long moment without saying anything. The specific, wordless communication of someone who doesn't need language for what she's trying to convey. The 12 veterans, most of whom I still hadn't met individually, moved through the reception with the specific, comfortable ease of people who have found something in an unexpected room that makes them feel less like outsiders, and I was aware of them collectively as a kind of shifted social center of gravity that hadn't existed when the afternoon began. There were also guests who circled the perimeter of my presence without entering it, who glanced, recalibrated, moved away with a specific social choreography of people deciding they'd rather not navigate whatever conversation might be required. I noticed this without judgment, because I have spent 10 years in rooms where my presence required recalibration from people who hadn't expected it, and I have learned to read that circling as information rather than insult. And then there was my mother. I want to describe my mother's trajectory across those first 40 minutes of the cocktail hour carefully, because I think the specific sequence of her movements tells its own story. She did not approach me immediately. What she did instead was what she does best, which is manage a room, moving through the guests with the practiced warmth of someone who has been good at this particular skill for decades, laughing at the right moments, touching arms, steering conversations, performing the specific role of the mother of the groom with a completeness that I have always genuinely admired as a skill, even when its deployment made me uncomfortable. I watched her cross the lawn toward me at the 38-minute mark, which I know because I had been tracking the time with the same background awareness I bring to any situation where I understand a particular event is coming and want to know where I am in relation to it. She walked with the specific, purposeful directness of someone who has decided, across 40 minutes of recalibrating, exactly what she wants to say and how she wants to say it. She stopped in front of me, and I want to describe her face because I think I've spent so much of this account describing what she said that I haven't fully described what she looked like, which is sometimes more honest than words. She looked, more than anything, tired. Not the tiredness of a difficult day, but the specific, deeper tiredness of someone who has been maintaining a particular position for a long time and has just spent 40 minutes in a room where that position had been publicly, undeniably complicated. "I need to talk to you," she said. "Okay," I said. She glanced around at the nearest guests, the specific glance of someone assessing for proximity and adjusting what they're about to say accordingly. "Not here. Can we find somewhere?" "Mom," I said, gently but directly, "whatever you want to say, you can say it here. I'm not going to find a private corner at my brother's wedding reception to have a difficult conversation. If something needs to be said, it can be said in the open." I want to explain why I said that, because I think it's the part of my own behavior in this story that requires the most honest accounting. I said it not to be difficult, and not to force a confrontation in public as a strategic move. I said it because I had learned, across 32 years of being my mother's daughter, that the conversations she requested in private corners almost always ended with me absorbing something I hadn't agreed to absorb, and walking back out into the public space wearing a shape I hadn't chosen. I was done having that particular kind of private conversation, at least on this day. My mother looked at me for a moment with an expression I've seen before, but only rarely. The specific look of someone realizing that the version of this conversation they'd prepared for is not the one that's going to happen. Then she said, in a voice kept carefully below the ambient noise of the cocktail hour, "I want you to know that you've embarrassed this family today." I let that sentence sit for a moment before I responded, because I think sentences like that deserve a moment rather than an immediate reaction. "I wore my formal uniform to my brother's formal wedding," I said. I haven't said anything to anyone about anything. I've been standing here drinking sparkling water. If something embarrassing happened today, I'd genuinely like to understand what it was. You know what happened, she said. Everyone was looking at you. All those men standing up, it made it about you, not about Jason and Jennifer. This was supposed to be their day. I want to describe what I felt hearing that because I think it's more complicated than simple anger. What I felt, more than anything, was the specific exhaustion of someone who has had a version of this conversation so many times that the novelty has worn completely away, and what remains is just the shape of it, recognizable as an old garment, familiar in its specific discomfort. The argument that my existence, my actual self, as presented honestly in a room, had made something about me that was supposed to be about someone else. I had heard this argument, in various forms, for 10 years. At my commissioning ceremony, when my mother had commented that I was drawing attention by being the only woman in my group receiving a specific assignment. At my Silver Star ceremony, when she had quietly suggested on the drive there that I not make a big deal of it with extended family, because she wasn't sure how to explain it to people who didn't understand the military. Every time I had shown up, in uniform, at any family event, and the room had responded to what the uniform meant, and the response had been reframed, always, as a problem of my making, rather than a response to something real. 12 veterans stood up, I said, because they recognized a decoration and responded to it the way they'd been trained to respond to it their entire professional lives. I didn't ask them to. I didn't know they would. I walked down an aisle in my formal clothes, and a group of men who served this country made a decision about how to respond to what they saw. That's not something I did to Jason's wedding. That's something that happened in Jason's wedding because of who those men are. It's still all anyone is talking about, she said. Then they're talking about something true, I said. She looked at me, and I looked at her. And I think we both understood, in that moment on a Connecticut lawn in September, that we had arrived at the specific place in a conversation where both people have said the true thing they came to say, and neither thing has changed the other's mind, and the only remaining question is what happens next. What happened next was not my mother, it was my father. He had been standing approximately 15 feet away, I realized, at the edge of the nearest cluster of guests, in the specific position of someone who has been close enough to hear, but has positioned himself with enough distance to maintain plausible deniability about whether he was listening. He was looking at his shoes when I noticed him, the specific downward attention of a man who is thinking about something he doesn't want to look at directly. He looked up when my mother moved away. She excused herself with the composed dignity she maintains even when things have not gone the way she planned, moving back into the social flow of the reception with the practiced ease of someone who has done this her entire adult life. And for a moment, my father and I simply looked at each other across 15 feet of manicured Connecticut lawn. He crossed the distance slowly, and when he reached me, he did something I hadn't expected, which was that he didn't say anything for almost a full 30 seconds. He stood beside me, looking out at the reception, at the guests and the white-clothed tables and the golden light, and the silence between us was different from the silence I'd been sitting with all day. Not comfortable exactly, but not hostile. Something more like the silence of two people who are both aware that the conversation they've been having for 10 years has, today, finally arrived somewhere that requires a different kind of response. I saw the general's face, he said finally, at the ceremony, when he put the medal on you. I saw how he looked at you. I said nothing, because I wasn't sure where he was going, and I've learned not to fill silences prematurely. I was looking at my phone, he said, during part of the speech. I know you know that. He paused. I don't know why I was looking at my phone. I've thought about it since, and I still don't have a good answer for it. I want to describe what that admission cost him, because I think it matters for understanding what it meant. My father is not a man who revisits his own behavior easily, or acknowledges it publicly, or offers its examination to someone else without significant resistance. The specific effort of what he'd just said was visible in the way he was standing, not the comfortable ease of a man making small talk at a wedding, but the specific physical tension of someone who has put something down that he's been carrying for a while and isn't sure what to do with his hands now that they're empty. I know, I said, because I did know, and I didn't want to pretend otherwise, and I also didn't want to make it easier than it was by immediately offering him absolution he hadn't asked for. I should have been watching, he said, the whole time. I should have watched the whole thing. I looked at my father standing beside me on that lawn. This man I had spent 32 years wanting to be proud of me in ways I could actually feel. And I felt something shift that I want to try to describe accurately, because I think the accuracy matters more than the narrative convenience of a clean emotional resolution. It didn't fix anything. The 4 minutes of his phone screen during the general speech were still those 4 minutes. The 10 years of impressive, said in a tone that closed conversations rather than opening them, were still those 10 years. None of that was different. But he was standing beside me on a lawn in September, at his son's wedding, saying a true thing he didn't have to say. And that was something. "You're here now," I said. He nodded, the specific nod of someone accepting a grace they understand they haven't fully earned. We stood together for a moment, looking out at the reception, and then he said something else, quietly, that I want to include here because I think it's the most honest thing my father has ever said to me directly. "I don't understand what you do," he said. "I've never fully understood it, but I saw those men stand up today and I understood that they understood, and I think I've been using not understanding as an excuse not to try harder to learn." I looked at him. He was still looking at the reception, not at me, which I think was the only way he could have said it. "I'd like that," I said, "if you wanted to try." He nodded again, and we didn't say anything else for a while, and it was enough. I want to tell you about Colonel Richard Hartwell, because I think he deserves his own chapter, and because what he did during the reception dinner was the moment the day shifted from something that had happened to me into something that happened for everyone in that room, whether they understood it that way or not. I was seated at a table near the front of the reception hall, in the specific placement that reflected my status as the groom's sister, close to the head table, visible, part of the immediate family arrangement that Jason and Jennifer had organized months earlier, with no apparent awareness that the seating chart would eventually need to accommodate the aftermath of 12 veterans standing up during the processional. I was between my Uncle Robert, who had greeted me with a warmth so uncomplicated I almost didn't know what to do with it, and an empty seat that had been designated for a cousin who had texted his regrets that morning. The Colonel was seated 2 tables away, at a round of 8 that appeared to be a mixture of Hartwell family members and older guests, and I was aware of him the way I'd been aware of him since the processional. Not intrusively, just as a fixed point in the room that I knew the coordinates of without needing to constantly verify them. Dinner was served, and I want to describe the specific social texture of that dinner because I think it matters for understanding what the Colonel's intervention meant when it came. The table I was seated at had, across the cocktail hour and the first 30 minutes of dinner, arrived at a specific, careful, conversational equilibrium. The kind that develops in a group of people who are aware that something significant has happened in the room and have collectively decided to address it through the medium of not addressing it. My Uncle Robert talked about his golf game. The cousin seated across from me talked about a renovation. The conversation moved around what had happened in the processional, the way water moves around a stone, present, aware, going everywhere except the place that would require acknowledgement. I participated without forcing anything, because I have learned that forced acknowledgement is rarely the kind that means anything, and because I genuinely had no desire to spend my brother's reception dinner relitigating a processional I had already stopped thinking of as a statement. The speeches began after the main course. Jason's best man gave a speech that was genuinely funny in the specific, self-deprecating way of someone who knows his audience well and trusts them to laugh at the right things. Jennifer's maid of honor gave a speech that made Jennifer cry, the specific happy crying of someone being loved in public by someone who knows them well. My mother gave a speech about Jason that was, I want to say honestly, beautiful. She is a genuinely gifted speaker when the subject is something she's comfortable with, and her love for her son is real and deep and entirely uncomplicated, the specific kind of uncomplicated love that exists between a mother and a child who has never given her reason to recalibrate. I watched her speak, and I felt, as I have always felt watching my mother be genuinely good at something, a complicated mixture of admiration and the specific ache of someone who has spent years wondering what it would feel like to be the subject of that particular gift, rather than the audience for it. Then the colonel stood up. I want to be precise about this moment, because it was not planned and not announced and not part of the formal program. And the specific way it happened, an 81-year-old man rising from a chair at a reception dinner, catching the attention of the room, not through volume, but through the quality of his presence, is something I think about still. He did not tap a glass. He did not raise his voice. He simply stood, and the table around him quieted first, the way tables quiet when someone at them does something unexpected, and then the quiet spread outward in the specific organic way that genuine attention spreads in a room, table by table, until the entire reception hall had gone quiet in the way it had gone quiet during the processional, that specific weighted silence of a room that has stopped what it was doing because something else is happening. I hope you'll forgive an old man for departing from the program, he said, and his voice was the voice of someone who has spent decades speaking in rooms where being heard clearly was a professional requirement, not loud, but carrying, with the specific resonance of absolute calm. I had not planned to speak tonight, but I find myself unable to sit quietly through the rest of this evening without saying something that I believe needs to be said. He turned toward my table, not dramatically, just the specific direct orientation of someone who wants to be honest about who they're addressing. Captain Mitchell, he said, I want to ask your permission to share something with this room. I want to describe what I felt in that moment because it was genuinely unexpected and because the specific quality of being asked rather than told, of an 81-year-old decorated veteran pausing to ask a 32-year-old captain's permission before speaking about her, was itself a lesson in something I don't have a clean word for, but have tried to practice in my own way across 10 years of service. Of course, sir, I said. He nodded once, the acknowledgement of someone receiving what they asked for and not requiring anything beyond it, and he turned back to the room. I served 30 years, he said. Korea and Vietnam, advisory missions in between, things I won't go into at a wedding dinner. A small, knowing sound moved through the veterans in the room, the specific private recognition of people who understand exactly what things I won't go into covers. I have known, across those 30 years and the 40 years since, a great many decorated soldiers. I have known men who received the nation's highest honors and bore them quietly, without making them the center of every room they entered. I have known men who received lesser honors and allowed them to become the whole of their identity. He paused, and the room was entirely still. What I saw this afternoon, when Captain Mitchell walked into this room, was something I have seen perhaps a dozen times in my life. Someone wearing a decoration not as a statement and not as a performance, but simply as what it is. Evidence of a specific day, a specific choice, a specific cost. The Silver Star is the third highest combat decoration this country awards. It is given for gallantry in the presence of an enemy. It is not given for service over time, or for good work consistently performed, or for showing up reliably across years, though all of those things deserve their own respect. It is given for one thing, doing something extraordinarily difficult under circumstances most people will never face, in a moment when not doing it would also have been understandable. He looked at me again, directly, and I held his gaze the way I'd been taught to hold the gaze of senior officers, steadily, without deference that becomes performance. I don't know what Captain Mitchell did to receive this decoration, he said. I don't know the specific circumstances, the specific day, the specific cost. That information belongs to her. What I do know, because I know what this decoration means and what it requires, is that on some day, in some place, this woman made a choice that most people would not have made, and that 2 people are alive today because she made it. The room was so quiet that I could hear, from somewhere outside, the distant sound of the string quartet that had been playing on the terrace during dinner. I want to tell you about my mother, because she was 3 tables away, and I was aware of her the entire time the colonel was speaking, in the peripheral, background way I'd been aware of her all day. I was not watching her directly. I was watching the colonel, because that was the correct thing to do, but I was aware of her the way you're aware of a significant variable, even when you're not looking at it directly, through the specific quality of the stillness around her, which had changed during his speech from the brittle, managed stillness of earlier to something with different texture. I didn't look at her until he finished, and when I did look, briefly, the thing I saw on her face was something I had not seen before in 32 years of knowing her. Not pride exactly, and not shame exactly, but something in the specific territory between them that doesn't have a clean name. The expression of someone encountering information they've had access to for years, in a form they've somehow never been able to receive until now. She was crying. Quietly, in the specific private way of someone who has not chosen to cry and is not performing it, just the specific involuntary response of a person who has been reached by something in a way they didn't plan for. I looked away. I think looking away was the correct thing to do. Some moments belong to the person having them, and that was hers. The colonel sat down, slowly and carefully, with the specific, deliberate care of an 81-year-old man who has done what he came to do. The room held its quiet for another few seconds, and then Jason stood up from the head table. I had not expected Jason to stand up. I want to be honest about that, because I think the expectation I'd carried into that day about my brother was one of the things that the day changed, and the honesty about that expectation matters as much as the honesty about what replaced it. He stood at the head table with Jennifer's hand in his, and he looked at me, and he said something that I am going to reproduce as accurately as I can, because I think precision matters here more than anywhere else in this account. "I owe my sister a public apology," he said. "Not for anything that happened today, for everything I didn't do before today, for the ceremony I didn't go to, for the questions I never asked, for letting the years go by without once asking what it actually cost her to do what she does." He paused, and his voice had the specific unsteadiness of someone saying a true thing in public for the first time, without having rehearsed it enough to smooth out the edges, which made it more true rather than less. "I'm glad you're here, Sarah. In that uniform. I'm glad you didn't listen to what anyone told you to wear." I looked at my brother at his wedding, standing up at his own head table to say something that cost him something real, and I felt, underneath everything else I'd been carrying and holding and managing all day, the specific, uncomplicated warmth of being genuinely seen by someone I had been wanting to be seen by for a very long time. "Thank you," I said, and I meant it the way I mean very few things, completely, without any of the careful management I'd been bringing to the rest of the day. Jennifer, beside him, was smiling the specific smile of someone who loves the person they've chosen, and is watching that person do something they're proud of. And I thought, not for the first time that afternoon, that my brother had chosen well. I want to tell you what happened after Jason sat back down, because the next 20 minutes were the most complicated of the entire day, and I think the complications matter as much as anything else that happened. My mother left the reception hall approximately 4 minutes after Jason's speech. Not dramatically. She didn't make a scene, didn't cause a disruption, simply rose from her table with the specific, composed dignity she maintains in public regardless of what's happening internally, said something quiet to my father, and walked toward the exit that led to the venue's interior hallway. My father followed her, 2 steps behind, with the specific expression of a man who understands that what's happening requires his presence, even if he doesn't entirely understand what form that presence should take. I watched them go without moving, because I had learned across the afternoon that the impulse to follow, to manage, to smooth over the discomfort before it fully resolved itself, was the exact impulse I needed to stop acting on. Whatever my mother needed to process in that hallway, she needed to process it without me adjusting the temperature of the room to make it easier for her. Priya, who was seated 2 tables away and had been watching the entire afternoon with the specific, alert attention of someone who loves you and is prepared to intervene if necessary, but has the wisdom to understand when not intervening is the actual intervention, caught my eye across the room and gave me the specific small nod that means, "I see what's happening and I'm here if you need me." I gave her the specific small nod back that means, "I know and I'm okay." The reception continued around me. the string quartet transitioned back to background music. The tables resumed their conversations, quieter now, with the specific texture of people who had witnessed something and were still absorbing it. The colonel, I noticed, was talking to one of the other veterans at his table with the comfortable ease of someone who has said what needed to be said and is now simply enjoying a wedding dinner. It was Jennifer who came to find me, which I want to describe carefully because I think her approach to the afternoon is the detail that redeemed the entire premise of the day for me in a way I hadn't expected to need redeemed. She sat down in the empty chair beside me, still in her wedding dress, with the specific, unself-conscious ease of a woman who has been in formal clothing long enough that she's stopped noticing it, and she looked at me directly with the same directness her mother had used earlier, which told me something about where Margaret Hartwell's quality of directness had come from. "I want to tell you something," she said, "and I want you to know it's not a speech. I'm not going to make it formal. I just want you to know." "Okay," I said. "When Jason told me that your parents had asked you not to wear your uniform," she said, "I want you to know that I told him I thought that was wrong. I want you to know that before any of today happened, I had already told my husband that I hoped you'd come in your uniform because I thought it was the right thing and I didn't understand why anyone would want otherwise." She paused. "I also want you to know that I didn't push hard enough on that. I told him once and then I let it go, and I think I should have pushed harder. I'm sorry for that." I looked at my new sister-in-law, this woman I had known for 2 years through the specific, careful distance of someone who isn't sure how they fit into a new family configuration, and I felt the specific, unexpected warmth of discovering that someone you'd been cautious about had been, the entire time, more straightforward than you'd given them credit for. "You don't need to apologize for that," I said. "You had a wedding to organize." "Still," she said, which is the same word my father had used, and which meant, in her mouth, the same thing it had meant in his, the specific acknowledgement that understanding why something happened doesn't entirely absolve anyone of it. She stayed beside me for a few minutes, and we talked about ordinary things. A mutual acquaintance, a funny moment from the rehearsal dinner, the specific logistical chaos of the morning's getting ready process. And it was, genuinely, the most comfortable conversation I'd had with my sister-in-law in 2 years of knowing her, which I think says something about the specific capacity of an honest day to clear out the accumulated distance that politeness and caution can build between two people who might otherwise simply like each other. My parents came back into the reception hall 32 minutes after they'd left, which I know because I had tracked the time in the same background way I'd been tracking things all day. My mother's composure was fully restored in the specific way it always restores. Completely, without residue, the specific professional dignity of someone who has learned to present a finished surface, regardless of what's happened behind it. My father looked slightly different from how he'd looked going out. Not changed exactly, but shifted. The specific quality of someone who has had a conversation they needed to have and is still adjusting to its weight. They returned to their table, and the reception continued, and the evening moved forward in the way wedding evenings move forward. Dancing eventually, more wine, the specific gradual warmth of a party finding its rhythm after the formal structures have fallen away. I danced with my Uncle Robert, who is my father's brother, and who has always been, in our family's constellation, the person most likely to say a true thing in a room that has decided not to say true things. He held my hand during a slow song and said, without preamble, "Your father called me last night, after your mother called him about the uniform. He asked me what I thought." "What did you tell him?" I said. "I told him that a man who spent 30 years not fully understanding what his daughter does for a living should probably spend the next 30 making up for it," he said. "And I told him that telling a decorated officer what to wear to a family event was the kind of thing that would embarrass him more than any uniform ever could, if he let himself think about it honestly." He paused. "I don't know if it helped." "It might have," I said, thinking about my father on the lawn. "Good," he said, with the specific satisfaction of someone whose intervention has landed in the intended place. "It took me until I was 60 to learn to say true things to my brother. I'm not sure I got there in time to matter, but I said them." I danced with Jason later in the evening, during a song I don't remember the name of, but that had the specific tempo of something chosen for exactly this kind of moment. Not too fast, not too formal, something that allowed for the specific kind of conversation that can only happen when two people are moving and don't have to look directly at each other for the whole of it. I meant what I said, he said, a few beats in. I know, I said. I've been a bad brother about this, he said. Not in any dramatic way, just absent, not asking, not showing up when I should have shown up, letting years go by because it was easier than figuring out how to be present for something I didn't understand. I thought about what I wanted to say, and I want to be honest that the version I chose was not the version that would have been most satisfying to deliver, the one that enumerated the ceremony he'd missed and the questions he'd never asked, and the 4 years of birthdays where his texts had been 2 emoji long. That version was true, and he deserved to hear it eventually, but I didn't think Jason's wedding dance floor was the place where that accounting would produce anything more than a conversation that neither of us had the space to finish properly. I'd like to change that, I said instead, if you actually want to. I do, he said. I want to know what happened. In Afghanistan. I want to know the whole thing, if you're willing to tell it. I thought about Marcus Webb, who calls me on my birthday. I thought about 11 minutes and a burning MRAP and a general whose face my father had missed while looking at his phone. I thought about the specific, unglamorous reality of what the whole thing actually contained, and whether my brother was prepared to hold it, and decided that the only way to find out was to trust him with it and see. Call me when you're back from the honeymoon, I said. I'll tell you the whole thing. He nodded, and we finished the dance, and he went back to his wife, and I stood at the edge of the dance floor in my dress blues and watched my brother's wedding continue around me and felt, more than anything, the specific, unhurried relief of someone who has spent a long day being exactly who they are and has discovered, slowly and imperfectly and with considerably more complication than they anticipated, that the room could hold it. My mother found me near the end of the evening, around 10:30, when the reception was winding down and the guests were beginning the specific, gradual drift toward exits that signals the end of a wedding night. She found me standing near the edge of the terrace, looking out at the September dark beyond the venue's lights, and she stood beside me the way my father had stood beside me on the lawn, not quite close enough to be a statement, but close enough to be intentional. She was quiet for almost a full minute. I let her be quiet because I had learned, today more than any other day, that the most important things my family had to say to me arrived in their own time rather than mine. I didn't know about Colonel Hartwell, she said finally. I didn't know any of them had served. I should have known, before I said what I said about Jennifer's family, what Jennifer's family actually was. No, I said gently, that's not actually the point. She looked at me. The point isn't that Jennifer's family turned out to be okay with the uniform, I said. The point is that it shouldn't have mattered who Jennifer's family was. The point is that you asked me to be smaller than I am, in a room I was invited into, wearing clothes that represent the most significant work of my life. That would have been the wrong ask, regardless of how the Hartwells felt about it. She was quiet again, and I could see her processing that, the specific, visible effort of someone receiving a true thing and trying to decide what to do with it. I know, she said finally, the same 2 words my father had said on the lawn, carrying the same specific weight of someone acknowledging something without yet knowing what comes next. I know you do, I said, and I meant it not as absolution, but as recognition, the specific acknowledgement that knowing something and acting on it are 2 different things that happen on different timelines, and that the knowing was at least the beginning. We stood together on that terrace for a few more minutes, watching the last of the reception wind down through the venue windows, the lights warm and the string quartet packing up and my brother visible inside, laughing at something with his new wife, entirely and uncomplicated happy in the way of someone who has just finished the best day of his life. My mother put her hand on my arm, briefly, the specific light touch of someone not sure how much contact is available to them at this particular moment, and I let her hand stay there, because whatever else was true about that day, she was my mother, and we were both standing in the dark outside a room where something real had happened, and that was enough for now, to stand in together. I want to tell you about the phone call with Marcus Webb, because it happened 3 days after the wedding, and because I think it belongs in this account, even though it took place entirely outside the venue and the reception and the specific Connecticut geography of everything else I've described. Marcus calls me on my birthday every year, which is in April, and I call him on his, which is in November. And in between, we exchange occasional texts that are brief and specific in the way of people who don't need to maintain a continuous conversational thread to understand that the connection between them is permanent. We have seen each other in person 4 times since Afghanistan, twice at Fort Bragg, once at a veterans event in Washington that neither of us particularly wanted to attend, but both attended because the organization running it had done genuinely good work, and once, briefly, when he'd been driving through North Carolina with his wife and daughter and had stopped for 3 hours, which was the first time I'd met his daughter, who was 18 months old and had the specific fearless quality of a child who has been loved from the first moment of her existence. He called on the Tuesday after the wedding, not his birthday call, but an unscheduled call, which happens occasionally, and I picked up the way I always pick up his calls, immediately, without considering whether I have time, because some calls you decide in advance to have time for. "I heard," he said without preamble. I asked him how. "Sergeant Donna," he said. "She's connected to someone who was there. You know how it travels." I do know how it travels. The specific, informal network of people who have served, the way information moves through it, the specific speed at which a story that matters to people who understand it finds the people who need to hear it. I have watched this happen enough times to stop being surprised by it. "Colonel Hartwell stood up first," I told him. "I know," he said. 30 years of service, Korea and Vietnam." A pause. "Sounds about right?" We were quiet for a moment, the specific, comfortable quiet of 2 people who share a reference point that doesn't require explanation. "I want to tell you something," Marcus said, and his voice had the specific quality it gets when he's about to say something he's thought about for a while. "I've been thinking about it since Donna called. About what it means that you walked in there in your uniform when someone asked you not to." I waited. "There was a minute in that vehicle," he said, and I knew immediately which minute he meant. Both of us knew, without naming it, the specific minute in the specific vehicle on the specific morning that sits at the center of everything we have ever talked about that matters, when I understood that you were going to come in regardless. Not because you'd calculated it, not because you'd decided the risk was acceptable, because it was the right thing to do and you didn't have the kind of time available to find a reason not to." He paused again. "That's the same thing you did at that wedding," he said. "I know it sounds different. I know one is considerably higher stakes than the other. But the mechanism is the same. Someone asked you to do the comfortable thing, the thing that would make the room easier, and you walked in anyway, wearing exactly what you were." I sat with that for a moment, because I think it deserved to be sat with rather than immediately responded to. "I don't know if I'd frame it that way," I said finally. "The wedding was considerably lower stakes." "Sure," he said, "but the part of you that does the thing is the same part. That's all I'm saying. And I'm glad that part of you is still in good shape." We talked for another 40 minutes about ordinary things. His daughter, who had recently discovered a strong and apparently very specific interest in dinosaurs, and could name 17 of them by their proper names, which Marcus delivered with the specific pride of a father who has been quizzed on this information repeatedly and is now genuinely knowledgeable about Cretaceous period paleontology against his will. About his prosthetic, which he'd had upgraded 6 months earlier and which had improved his golf game, he said, though he'd never played golf before losing his hand, and therefore wasn't sure the baseline was meaningful. About the small business he and his wife had been building for 3 years, a logistics consulting firm, which was growing in the specific, unglamorous, steady way of something built correctly. Before he hung up, he said one more thing. "Tell your brother the whole story," he said, "when he calls. Don't give him the version where you spare him the hard parts. Give him the actual thing. He'll handle it." I asked him how he could possibly know whether my brother would handle it. "Because he stood up at his own wedding and apologized in public," Marcus said. "That's not nothing. That's actually something. Give him the chance to prove it was real." I told him I would, and I meant it. I want to jump forward to the conversation with my brother, which happened 11 days after the wedding, on a Tuesday evening, when Jason called from what I could hear was a hotel room somewhere warm. He and Jennifer had gone to Portugal for their honeymoon, which I knew because my mother had mentioned it 3 times in the preceding month, and the specific ambient warmth in his voice confirmed they'd had a good time. He called, as he said he would, and he asked, as he said he would, to hear the whole thing. I told him. I want to be honest that I told him in the way Marcus had told me to tell him, without the version where the hard parts get softened, without the version where the 11 minutes become something manageable and narrative-shaped, without the version where you remove the specific smell of burning fuel and the specific weight of a man you're pulling and the specific sound of ammunition cooking off in a vehicle that was, at that moment, something between a hazard and a catastrophe. I told him about the morning, about the comms I was monitoring and the call that came in, and the calculation I made, which was not a heroic calculation, but a professional one. The same kind of calculation I make in any medical evacuation situation, applied to a circumstance that was considerably more immediate than most. I told him about the specific moment I reached the first soldier, who was conscious and terrified, and about the second one, who was Marcus, who was not fully conscious, but whose hand I held the entire time we were getting him out, which I don't know if he knows, but which I know, and which matters to me in the specific, private way of things that happened in real time and belong entirely to themselves. I told him about the general's face, which my father had mentioned on the lawn. I told him what I'd been told about my father's phone, not accusatorially, just as part of the honest accounting of the day, because Jason deserved the whole picture if he was going to understand why the wedding had landed the way it had. He was quiet for a long time after I finished, not the uncomfortable quiet of someone who doesn't know what to say, but the specific, weighted quiet of someone sitting with something they've just been given that they understand they're going to need time with. "I'm sorry I wasn't there," he said finally, "at the ceremony. I know I said it at the wedding, but I want to say it again, without an audience, because I think it means something different without an audience." "It does," I said. "Thank you." "I'm also sorry I've never asked before," he said. "I think I was scared of not understanding it, of it being something I couldn't relate to and not knowing what to do with that, which is a terrible reason to not ask your sister about the most important thing in her life." I thought about what Marcus had said about giving Jason the chance to prove his public apology was real, and I thought about the specific, unglamorous courage it takes to call someone on a Tuesday from a honeymoon hotel and ask to hear the hard version of a story you've been avoiding for 4 years. "You're asking now," I said. "I'm asking now," he agreed. We talked for almost 2 hours that evening, and I want to describe what those 2 hours felt like, because I think it's the emotional center of this entire account. Not the processional, not the colonel's speech, not my mother's hand on my arm in the dark outside the venue, but 2 siblings on the phone, one in a hotel in Portugal and one in an apartment in North Carolina, having for the first time the actual conversation that 10 years of distance and avoidance and careful management had kept them from having. He asked good questions, the specific quality of someone who is genuinely trying to understand rather than simply performing interest, questions that required him to hold the answers rather than move past them, questions that sometimes produced a silence on his end that I recognized as thinking rather than discomfort. At some point, around the 90-minute mark, he said something that I want to include here because I think it's the most honest thing my brother has ever said to me directly, and because I think honesty deserves to be recorded when it arrives. "I've spent a lot of years being proud of you in the abstract," he said. "Like, I knew you were impressive. I knew you'd done something significant. But I kept it abstract because keeping it abstract meant I didn't have to reckon with the specific reality of what it cost, and what it means, and what I wasn't doing while you were doing it." He paused. "I think I was using impressive the same way Dad does, as a word that closes a conversation instead of opening one. I thought about my father, standing on the lawn, saying the same thing about himself in different words. "I think that's right," I said. "I don't want to do that anymore," he said. I know, I said. I believe you. And I did believe him, in the specific, evidence-based way of someone who has watched a person do something difficult in public and then do something equally difficult in private, which is the combination that actually distinguishes intention from performance. Before we hung up, he asked me one more thing. What do you need from me going forward? Like, specifically, not generally. What do you actually need? I thought about it honestly, because it deserved an honest answer. Show up, I said, to the things that matter. Ask questions you actually want to know the answers to. Don't use impressive as a full stop. And if you ever find yourself in a room where someone is asking me to be smaller than I am, say something. I can do that, he said. I know you can, I said. 6 months have passed since the wedding, and I want to tell you what those 6 months have actually looked like, because I think the honest, unglamorous aftermath of a day like that one matters more than the day itself. And because I've come to believe that the real measure of whether something true happened in a room is not what people said in the room, but what they did when they went home from it. I want to start with my father, because his arc across those 6 months has been the one that surprised me most, and I think surprise is worth being honest about when it happens. He called me the Sunday after the wedding, which was itself unusual, because my father is not a Sunday caller. He operates on the specific paternal communication pattern of a man who reaches out when there is a logistical reason to reach out, and otherwise trusts that the relationship's continuity will maintain itself through proximity and holiday gatherings. A Sunday call, without a logistical reason, was its own statement. He asked how I was doing. We talked for 20 minutes about ordinary things. Before he hung up, he said he had been reading about the Silver Star. Not the specific citation, which is not publicly detailed, but the general history and criteria of the decoration, the kind of research a man does when he has decided, belatedly, that understanding something is within his capacity if he applies himself to it. I didn't know what the criteria were, he said. I knew it was important. I didn't know what it actually meant, specifically what it required. I told him what it required briefly, in the same plain language the citation uses, and there was a silence on his end that I recognized as the specific silence of someone absorbing information they understand they should have sought years earlier. I should have looked it up a long time ago, he said. You looked it up now, I said. He calls every Sunday. I want to be clear about what that means and what it doesn't mean. It doesn't mean our relationship is transformed. Doesn't mean 10 years of impressive as a conversation closer have been retroactively resolved into something else. What it means is that my father has decided, at 64, to do a specific, concrete thing differently, and that he does it every week without requiring recognition for the effort, which is, I think, the most honest form of accountability available to someone who understands that what they're correcting is not a single mistake, but a decade of a habit. Some weeks we talk about ordinary things. Some weeks, increasingly, he asks specific questions about what I do, about the operational structure of the work I'm responsible for, about the specific mechanics of things he's read about in the weeks between calls. He is not always comfortable with what he learns. There have been several conversations that ended with a silence I recognized as genuine discomfort rather than indifference, and I have come to understand that discomfort as its own form of engagement. The specific, real difficulty of a man who spent 30 years maintaining a comfortable distance from something his daughter was doing, now choosing to close that distance, even when what he finds there is harder than the distance was. Last month, he asked me about Afghanistan. Not in the indirect, carefully managed way he'd always approached anything near that subject, but directly. I want to hear what happened. The whole thing. I told him the same version I'd told Jason, without the softening, and he listened the way he'd been learning to listen across 6 months of Sunday calls. Quietly, with the specific attention of someone who has decided that listening is a skill worth practicing. When I finished, he said nothing for almost 2 full minutes. Then he said, I was looking at my phone. I know, I said. I've thought about it every week since the wedding, he said. Every single week. I can't undo it. I just want you to know it's the thing I think about when I think about what I've gotten wrong. I want to be honest about what I felt hearing that, because I think the honest answer is more useful than the clean one. I felt the specific, complicated emotion of someone receiving genuine remorse from a person they love, understanding simultaneously that the remorse is real and that it doesn't undo the 4 minutes, and finding that both of those things can be true at the same time without one canceling out the other. I told him I appreciated him saying it. I meant that completely. My relationship with my mother is slower. I want to be honest about that because I think the honest accounting of this family requires acknowledging that different people move through the same event at different speeds, and that my mother, who is more defended than my father in certain specific ways, has been working through what happened at a pace that doesn't always match what I might want from it. We talk approximately every 2 weeks. The conversations are warmer than they were before the wedding, genuinely warmer, with a specific quality of carefulness on both sides that I think reflects a mutual, unspoken understanding that something cracked open in September, and that how we handle what's inside it matters. She has not, in 6 months, asked me to present myself differently to anyone. I want to note that not as a low bar, but as a genuine, meaningful change, the specific absence of something that was always present before, noticed now by its absence in the way you notice a sound that's been constant when it finally stops. She sent me a photograph, 2 months after the wedding. A photograph I had never seen before, from my Silver Star ceremony. Not one of the official photographs, which I have, but a candid one she had taken herself, apparently, from her seat in the audience, of the specific moment the general placed the medal around my neck. In the photograph, my face is visible in profile, and the general's, and the medal itself, and the light in the room, and I look, in the photograph, exactly like someone doing the most significant thing they have done in their life. She had written nothing on the back of the photograph, and she had sent no accompanying message. Just the photograph, in an envelope, with my name and address in her handwriting. I put it on my desk, next to the spreadsheets and the operational documents and the other evidence of the work I do every day, and it has been there since. I want to tell you about Colonel Hartwell, because he and I have exchanged letters. Actual letters, the specific form of communication that felt right for the specific quality of what happened between us. He wrote first, 3 weeks after the wedding, in the handwriting of a man whose hands have written a great many documents across a long life, and what he wrote was not long. He said he had been in rooms with decorated soldiers his entire career, and had occasionally seen someone carry a decoration the way it deserved to be carried, and that he wanted me to know I was among them. He said he had not stood up to make a point, but because it was the correct response to what he'd seen, and that the other 11 men who'd stood had made the same calculation independently, which he said was itself a kind of testimony. I wrote back. We have exchanged 4 letters since, and I want to describe what those letters contain, because I think it's the detail that best captures what the day produced that I didn't go looking for. We write about service, about the specific, practical reality of it, the unglamorous mechanics of what it actually looks and feels like to do this work across years, the things that are difficult to explain to people who haven't done it, and the specific relief of finding someone who already understands. He is 81 and I am 32, and we have nothing in common except the most important thing, and the letters feel, each time, like the specific luxury of a conversation I've been waiting to have without knowing I was waiting. Jason and I have talked 6 more times since the honeymoon call. Real conversations, the kind that take time and produce silence in the right places, the kind where someone asks a question they genuinely want the answer to, and then holds the answer rather than moving past it. He has asked Marcus Webb's name, and the name of the other soldier. He has asked what Kandahar province looks like in March, which nobody has ever asked me before, and I described it as honestly as I could. Flat and cold and specific in the way of places that are going to stay with you. He has asked what I'm proud of, not about Afghanistan, but across my career, and I gave him an answer that surprised me a little in its honesty, because I hadn't formulated it before and found, saying it out loud, that it was true. What I'm proud of, I told him, is the specific, accumulated quality of having done the work every day, regardless of whether anyone was watching or understanding or correctly categorizing what I was doing. The specific dailiness of it, the years between moments, the ordinary work that doesn't produce decorations or ceremonies, the consistency of showing up to something difficult and unglamorous and genuinely important without requiring the room to recognize it in real time. He said, I think that's what I saw in that church, not the medal, the dailiness of it. I thought about that for a long time after we hung up, and I think he was right, and I think it's the most accurate description anyone has ever offered of what I was actually doing when I walked into that venue in my dress uniform on a Saturday afternoon in September. I was not making a statement. I was not staging a moment. I was simply showing up, as I had shown up every day for 10 years, wearing exactly what I was, carrying exactly what I had earned, in a room that had been told, by someone who loved me but did not yet fully understand me, to expect someone smaller. The room turned out to be larger than that expectation. The people in it turned out, most of them, to be capable of more than the expectation required. And I turned out, as I have turned out every day for 10 years in rooms considerably more difficult than a Connecticut wedding venue, to be exactly who I am. That is enough. It has always been enough. It simply took a specific September afternoon and 12 men rising from their chairs and an 81-year-old colonel with 30 years of service and a letter-writing habit for the room around me to finally understand what I had known about myself the whole time.